Hello there, and welcome. I am so glad you are here with me today. Before we begin, let us take a quiet moment together. I want you to feel comfortable. Put your shoulders down. Let your hands rest easy on your lap. Now, I invite you to take a slow breath in through your nose. Hold it softly for 1 second. And then let it out through your mouth, nice and slow. One more time. Breathe in and breathe out. Good. That is all we needed. Thank you for giving yourself this small moment of peace. Today, we are going to do something special. We are going to listen to a true story from a very long time ago. But this is not just any story. It is a story about a man who learned how to stay calm when everything around him was falling apart. It is a story about quiet strength, about clear thinking in the middle of confusion, and about a small book that carried a very big idea across 2,000 years. I will tell you this story slowly. I will use simple words, and I will explain the harder words as we go. So you do not need to be afraid of new vocabulary. You do not need to understand every single word the first time. Just listen. Let the story wash over you like warm water. And little by little, your ears will learn, your mind will grow, and your heart will understand, because that is how real language learning works. It is not about being perfect. It is about showing up, listening, and letting the story do its quiet work. Today, our story begins in a cold place, very far from here. And very long ago, almost 2,000 years ago, in the lands near a great river called the Danube. A river. A river is a long body of moving water that flows across the land. The Danube River runs through the middle of Europe, and in the winter, near that river, the wind is sharp, the ground is hard, and the nights are very, very long. On one of those long nights, in a simple army camp, a man sat alone. He was not sleeping like the other soldiers. He was not eating or talking by the fire. He sat on a small wooden chair, inside a simple tent made of thick cloth. A small oil lamp burned beside him. An oil lamp is a small light that burns oil to make a flame. The flame gave a soft, warm gold light. It lit the man's face from the side, and it lit the small book in his hands. The man opened the book. He picked up his pen, and he began to write. Not orders for his army, not a letter to a friend. He wrote words only for himself, words about how to be a good person, how to control his anger, how to accept the things he could not change. He wrote slowly and carefully. Outside, the cold wind pushed against the tent. Far away, a soldier coughed in the dark. Somewhere, a horse moved and made a soft sound. But the man did not stop writing. He wrote about fear, he wrote about pain, he wrote about death, and he wrote about how to live well, even when life is hard. This man was not a normal soldier. This man was the most powerful person in the entire Roman Empire. He was an emperor. His name was Marcus Aurelius. Now, you may know the word emperor. An emperor is a ruler, a king above kings, a person with enormous power. He could give orders to thousands and thousands of men. He could make laws. He could start wars or end them. And yet, on this cold night, he sat alone, writing quiet words in a small notebook. Words that nobody expected an emperor to write, because he was not writing for power. He was writing for peace, his own peace. And that is where our story truly begins. So find a comfortable position. Let your body relax. You can close your eyes if you like, or keep them open. It is up to you. Just let yourself be here. Let the words come to you, and together we will meet the man behind the title, the philosopher who wore a crown, the emperor who carried a small book into the middle of a storm. The tent was small, but the man inside it was not. In the great city of Rome, he lived in a palace. He had servants. He had fine clothes. He had the best food and the softest beds. But here, at the edge of the empire, he slept on a simple cot. He ate the same bread as his soldiers. He wore the same heavy cloak, and every night, he wrote in his little book. Why was the emperor in a tent at all? Because Rome was at war. For years, the empire had fought against tribes from the north. These tribes lived beyond the great Danube River. The river was the border. On one side, Rome. On the other side, lands the Romans could not control. And now, the people from those lands wanted to cross. They wanted new homes. They wanted safety. They wanted what Rome had, so they came with swords and spears. They crossed the river in the dark. They burned villages and took what they could carry. And Marcus Aurelius, the emperor of Rome, went to fight them. He was not a young man anymore. He was in his 50s. His body was tired, his health was weak, but he believed it was his duty. An emperor must protect his people. An emperor must stand with his soldiers. So he marched with them. He slept where they slept, and he wrote. The people of Rome had a word for the tribes across the river. They called them barbarians. To a Roman, a barbarian was someone who did not speak Latin or Greek, someone from outside the empire, someone different. To many Romans, barbarians were dangerous. They were the enemy, but the man in the tent did not see it that way. He did not hate the people across the river. He understood they were human, just like him. They had families, they had fears, they wanted to live. But he also knew his job was to defend Rome, so he fought, and he wrote. The lamp burned low, the man turned a page. His handwriting was careful, but not perfect. He did not write to be admired. He wrote to remind himself of the truth, because in the middle of a war, it is easy to forget. Easy to forget that power does not make a person good. Easy to forget that every day could be the last. Easy to forget that we are all small, and life is short. He wrote this in Greek, not Latin. Greek was the language of philosophy, and philosophy, well, that word simply means the love of wisdom. A philosopher is a person who thinks deeply about how to live. Marcus Aurelius was a philosopher, maybe the first true philosopher to ever rule the Roman Empire. And the book he wrote in that tent would outlive him. It would outlive the empire itself. Today, we call it the Meditations. But he never meant for anyone to read it. He wrote it only for himself, a private diary, a conversation with his own soul. The war went on for years. The man did not live to see the end of it. But the words he wrote in that tent survived. They traveled through time. They were copied by hand, again and again. They were translated into dozens of languages, and today, nearly 2,000 years later, people still read them. People like you. People who want to learn. People who want to grow. Now I want you to think about something. Think about the last time you felt stressed. Maybe you had too much work. Maybe someone was unkind to you. Maybe you felt afraid of something you could not control. We all have moments like that. And Marcus Aurelius wrote about exactly this. He wrote about how to stay calm when the world feels loud, how to be strong when things go wrong, how to be good when it is easier to be bad. So here is the plan for today. We will follow the life of this man, from a young student in Rome to the ruler of an empire. We will learn the ideas that guided him, ideas with funny old names, like Stoicism. But do not worry. Stoicism is not a hard word. It is not a religion. It is not a set of rules you must follow. Stoicism is simply a way of thinking, a tool for life, a tool you can use every day, and the best part is, you already use it sometimes. When you stay calm in traffic, that is a little bit stoic. When you let go of anger and choose to be kind, that is stoic too. Marcus Aurelius just practiced it more than most people. He practiced it in the hardest job in the world. And he wrote down what he learned, so we could learn too. So let us start at the beginning. Let us start with a boy. Marcus was born in Rome, in the year 121. His family was rich and powerful, but his father died when Marcus was only 3 years old. He did not grow up with a father. He grew up with his mother and his grandfather, and from a very young age people noticed something special about him. He was serious. He was honest. He did not like to lie. He did not like to waste time. He loved to read. He loved to learn. The old emperor at that time was a man named Hadrian. Hadrian saw the boy and liked him very much. He gave Marcus a nickname. He called him Verissimus. That means the most truthful one, because Marcus always told the truth, even when it was hard. Hadrian wanted Marcus to be emperor one day, but Marcus was too young, so Hadrian made a plan. He told another man, a good man named Antoninus, to adopt Marcus. Adopt means to take a child into your family as your own son, so Antoninus adopted Marcus. He became Marcus's new father, and he taught Marcus how to be a good ruler, how to be patient, how to listen. Marcus loved Antoninus. He respected him. And Marcus watched him closely. He saw how Antoninus worked. He saw how he treated people with fairness. He saw how he never let power make him cruel. These lessons stayed with Marcus for his whole life. But there was another teacher who changed Marcus even more. His name was Junius Rusticus. He was a philosopher. One day, Rusticus gave Marcus a book. It was a special book. The book was by a man named Epictetus. Epictetus had been a slave, but he became one of the wisest men in the world, and his book changed everything for young Marcus. The book said something very simple, but very deep. It said, "Some things are in your control, some things are not. If you can control it, act. If you cannot control it, let it go." That was the beginning of Marcus's Stoic journey. From that day, he stopped studying just words and speeches. He started studying how to live. He started asking himself questions every day. What can I control today? What should I let go? And those questions would guide him for the rest of his life, even when he became the most powerful man in the world. Years passed. Marcus grew from a boy into a young man. He learned everything a future emperor needed to know. He learned about law. He learned how the army worked. He learned how to speak to large groups of people. He learned how to write clearly and strongly. But Marcus kept one lesson close to his heart, above all the others, the Stoic lesson, the idea that some things are in his control and some things are not. When he was 17 years old, something important happened. A man named Hadrian, the emperor at that time, noticed Marcus. Hadrian saw something special in the young man. He saw honesty. He saw hard work. He saw a mind that never stopped asking questions. Hadrian gave Marcus a nickname. He called him Verissimus. That word means the most truthful one. Hadrian died a short time later. Before he died, he made a careful plan. He wanted to leave Rome with a good ruler, so he chose a wise man named Antoninus to become the next emperor. And before Hadrian closed his eyes for the last time, he gave Antoninus one clear instruction. He said, "Take Marcus as your son, prepare him, teach him, he will rule after you." Antoninus did what Hadrian asked. He became the new emperor, and he welcomed Marcus into his home as his own son. Marcus was now very close to the most powerful seat in the world. But this new position did not change his character. He kept practicing Stoicism every single day. Every morning he asked himself the same quiet questions. What can I control today? What should I accept? How can I be useful to the people around me? He wrote his thoughts in small notebooks. He walked through the streets of Rome. He watched people work. He watched children play near the fountains. He listened to the sounds of the city waking up. He noticed how quickly life moved, how people worried about small things, money, status, what other people thought of them. Marcus saw all of this clearly, and he made a quiet promise to himself. He would not become a man ruled by pride. He would not let power twist his mind. He would remember that he was just a man who would die someday, like everyone else. Then, when Marcus was 40 years old, Antoninus died, and Marcus became the emperor of Rome. He ruled the largest empire in the world at that time. It stretched from Britain in the north to Egypt in the south. Millions of people lived under his rule. Armies guarded the borders. Merchants sailed across the seas. Temples stood in every city. But Marcus did not keep all the power for himself. He made a surprising choice. He chose his adopted brother, a man named Lucius Verus, to rule beside him. This was something new for Rome. For the first time in its history, the empire had two emperors, equal in rank. Marcus believed that sharing the burden was wise. One man alone could not carry the weight of the whole world. The first few months were peaceful. Marcus and Lucius worked together. They made new laws to protect the poor. They built roads and public buildings. They settled arguments between citizens. Marcus judged each case with great care. He listened to both sides. He asked many questions. He never punished anyone out of anger. He believed in fairness, and the people respected him for it. But then came trouble, and it came from many directions at once. From the east came news of war. The Parthian Empire, a powerful kingdom beyond the eastern border, had attacked Roman lands. Their armies marched into cities and burned them. People fled in fear. Marcus sent his brother Lucius to lead the Roman army against them. Lucius was young and not a soldier by nature, but he went because it was his duty. While Lucius was away, Marcus stayed in Rome. He worked from early morning until late at night. He read reports from the front. He met with advisors and judges. He wrote letters to governors in distant provinces. Every day brought new problems that needed his attention. And every day, he tried to face them with a calm and steady mind. Then something terrible happened. A plague came to Rome. Soldiers returning from the Eastern War brought the sickness with them. It spread through the city like fire through dry grass. Thousands of people became ill. They had fevers and sores on their skin. Many of them died. The streets that had been full of life now stood quiet. Carts carried bodies out of the city every day. The air smelled of smoke from the fires that burned the dead. Marcus did not run from the plague. He did not hide in his palace. He stayed in Rome and did what he could. He used his own money to pay for medicines and doctors. He opened the royal storehouses to feed the hungry. He comforted people in the streets, walking among the sick even when others were afraid to go near them. A plague is a terrible sickness that spreads quickly and kills many people. It was the worst disaster Rome had seen in many years. Some historians believe it killed 5 to 10 million people across the empire. To understand that number, imagine every person in a great city like New York or Los Angeles. Now imagine them all gone. That is how many people died. And still the trouble did not stop. In the north, along the Danube River, Germanic tribes gathered in large numbers. They had heard that Rome was weak. They had heard about the plague and the war in the east. They saw their chance. These tribes crossed the frozen river in winter and attacked Roman towns on the other side. They took food and goods. They burned farms. They pushed deeper into Roman territory with every passing month. The Danube is a long river that flows through Central Europe. It marked the northern edge of the Roman Empire. Beyond it lay lands that the Romans called barbarian territory. The word barbarian was what Romans called anyone who did not speak Latin or Greek. To the Roman mind, these were wild and dangerous people. Now Marcus faced a terrible choice. He had war in the east, he had plague in the cities, and he had invaders in the north. 3 great dangers, all at the same time. Any one of them would have been enough to break a weaker man. Marcus felt the weight of all 3 pressing down on him every single day. But here is where his philosophy showed its true power. Marcus did not panic. He did not fall into despair. He did not curse the gods or blame others for his problems. Instead, he did something remarkable. He went to war himself, and he brought his journal with him. The camp stretched along the frozen bank of the Danube. Tents stood in long rows, their leather walls dark with frost. Smoke rose from cooking fires in thin gray lines that bent in the wind. Soldiers walked between the tents with their shoulders pulled tight against the cold. Some coughed, some stared into the fires without speaking. Over everything hung the same question: could Rome survive this winter? Marcus spent his days inside a plain command tent. It looked nothing like the golden rooms of the palace he had left behind. A simple wooden table, a folding chair, a small oil lamp that burned through the long nights, and on that table, something more valuable than any crown or coin: his journal. Every evening, after the reports had been read and the officers had gone, Marcus opened the journal. The pages were made of papyrus, pressed thin and smooth. The ink was dark against the pale surface. He wrote in Greek, the language of philosophers, not Latin, the language of soldiers. And what he wrote was not for other people to read, it was for himself. It was a mirror. He wrote about the cold that bit through his cloak. He wrote about the faces of the young soldiers who shivered and hoped to see home again. He wrote about his own fear. He did not hide from it. He looked at it directly. A man who is afraid is still a man, he wrote. The question is what he does with that fear. This was what Junius Rusticus had taught him all those years ago in the quiet halls of Rome. Philosophy was not something you read about. It was something you did. It was a skill, like riding a horse or throwing a spear, and like any skill, it needed practice every day. Not practice when life was easy, practice when life was hard, especially then. Let me show you what that practice looked like. Marcus sat at his table. The lamp flickered. Outside, the wind pulled at the tent ropes. Somewhere in the dark, a horse whinnied. He picked up his pen and began with a simple exercise. The Stoics called it the discipline of perception. That means training your mind to see things clearly, without panic and without fantasy. He asked himself one question before anything else. What is in my control? The plague in Rome, was that in his control? No. He could not command a disease to leave the city. The anger of the tribes across the river, was that in his control? No. He could not reach into another man's heart and change what he wanted. The weather, the supply lines, the fear that moved through his soldiers like a second plague, none of it. He wrote each one down and let it go. Then he asked the second question, what is in my control? His own thoughts, his own judgment, the way he treated the men around him, the decision to get up in the morning and do the work again, that was his ground. That was the only ground that could never be taken from him. Everything else was borrowed. The body was borrowed. The throne was borrowed. Even his own name, Antoninus, was borrowed from the man who had raised him. Only the mind inside him was truly his. He wrote these things slowly, in simple words. He was not trying to impress anyone. He was trying to steady himself, like a man putting his feet on solid stone while the river raged around him. Then he did something that sounds strange to us today. He had a conversation with himself. Not aloud, on the page. He imagined that the day had not happened yet, that he was standing at dawn, before the sun rose, and the whole day lay in front of him like an unopened letter. He asked himself, who will I meet today? The man who talks too much, the man who lies, the man who is angry for no reason, the man who thinks he knows everything. They cannot hurt me, he wrote, because they do not control my mind. They are humans, like me. They have the same nature. Maybe they do wrong because they do not know better. That is not my problem. My problem is how I act. Then he imagined the first hard moment of the day, a senator who flatters him but wants something, a soldier who disobeys, a messenger with bad news from the front. He prepared himself for each one, the way a man checks his coat before going out into the cold. If the senator flatters me, I will not need his praise. If the soldier runs, I will not lose my calm. If the messenger brings dark news, I will receive it with a steady face. The news is already true. Hiding from it will not make it false. This was his morning practice. A few quiet minutes before the world reached him. Not prayer, not magic, just preparation. He knew that a small, ready mind could do more than a big, unprepared one. And every day, in that camp by the frozen river, the world did come for him. It always did, but he had already met it once on the page, and that made it smaller. Let me show you what his days in that camp were like. The first light came through the tent walls, gray and thin. The air inside was so cold that the water in the bowl by his bed had a skin of ice on it. He broke the ice with his finger, washed his face, and dressed without calling for help. He did not want servants running around him while other men slept on the hard ground. Outside the tent, the camp was already waking. Along the river, the watchfires spat smoke into the fog. Soldiers stood in their winter cloaks, stomping their feet to keep warm. Somewhere, a mule cried out. Somewhere else, a man coughed with the dry cough that everyone tried not to hear. The plague had followed them, and that cough had followed the plague. One man would cough in the morning. By the evening, 3 more would be coughing. By the end of the week, the doctor would shake his head, and a burial party would carry someone out past the north gate. The emperor saw it all. He could not stop it. That was the truth he woke up to every day. But here is the strange thing. The men did not see an emperor who was crushed by all of this. They saw an emperor who worked. He read reports. He judged cases between soldiers. He walked the camp and spoke to the men by name. He ate the same bread they ate. He did not hide in his tent. And the men saw that, and something in them steadied too. One officer wrote later that the emperor's presence in the camp was worth another legion. That is a big claim. But when a man sees his leader stand calmly in the middle of chaos, he borrows some of that calm. But where did that calm come from? It did not come from good news. The news was bad, every day, for months. It came from practice, the daily practice of a philosophy he had carried with him since he was a young man. Every morning, before the reports, before the judgments, before the first cup of water, he sat alone and wrote a few lines. Not for anyone to read, just for himself, a small talk from one man to himself. He reminded himself that the sun will rise, whether we want it to or not, that people will be difficult, whether we want them to be or not, that the only thing we truly own is our own mind, and that a mind can be trained the way a hand is trained, the way a leg is trained, until it moves the right way without being told. He wrote these things in a little book, page by page, through the whole war. The book had no title. He never planned to publish it. It was just a man, in a tent, on the edge of the empire, teaching himself how to stay human. And then came the summer of 172, and a test that no philosophy lesson could ever prepare a man for. The 12th Legion was trapped. A large enemy force had surrounded them in a dry valley, far from the river. The soldiers had marched for days, and now they had no water. The heat came down on them like a weight. Men leaned on their shields, lips cracked, eyes dull. The enemy did not attack. They did not need to. They just waited, on the hills, in the shade of the trees, watching the Romans cook alive in the open sun. The officers looked at the emperor. What could he do? He could not dig a river. He could not pull rain out of the sky. His philosophy said to accept what you cannot control. But the soldiers were his responsibility, and a leader cannot accept the death of his men with a calm mind. He stood with them in the dust. He prayed, in his own way, not to beg for magic, but to ask for clear thought. Then, the sky changed. Before we move deeper into the road, let me ask you to do something small. Right now, wherever you are, set your shoulders down a little. Unclench your jaw. Let your hands rest. We have been moving through a big story, and your mind has been working hard to follow each word. That is good. That is exactly what we want. But even the strongest traveler stops for water. Take one slow breath in through your nose. Hold it for just a moment. Now let it out through your mouth, as soft as you can. Do that once more. Breathe in and out. Good. You do not need to rush this. The story will wait for you. In fact, a calm mind hears better. When your body is tense, your brain spends energy on that tension. When you relax, more of your attention can stay with the words. This is not a trick. It is how listening works. A relaxed listener catches more. A relaxed listener remembers more. So we breathe before we continue. Here is a small way to practice this in your own life. Maybe you are on a bus. Maybe you are at a desk. Maybe you are lying in bed with your phone. Wherever you are, you can pause for 10 seconds. Breathe in slowly. Count to 4 in your head. Breathe out slowly. Count to 6. That longer breath out says to your body, you are safe. Your heart slows. Your mind stops running for a moment. When you do this before studying English, you make a small room for the language to enter. That room is quiet. That room is yours. The man we are talking about today, Marcus Aurelius, understood this idea very well. He lived nearly 2,000 years ago. He ruled the largest empire on earth. Soldiers fought on cold northern rivers. A terrible sickness moved through crowded cities. People were afraid. People were angry. And through all of it, Marcus wrote short notes to himself at night. Notes about staying calm. Notes about breathing. Notes about knowing what he could control and what he could not. He did not write those notes to be famous. He wrote them to survive his own mind. And that is part of why his words still matter today. They were real. They came from pressure. So as we step back into his world, try to carry this breathing with you. Not just now. Not just today. Make it a habit. Before you listen. Before you speak. Before you read a hard page. Breathe first. Then open your ears. Your English will not grow from panic. It will grow from calm attention. One day at a time. That is the same lesson Marcus gave himself in a tent beside a war. He could not stop the war. He could not stop the plague. But he could slow his own breath. He could choose his next thought, and so can you. Now, let your eyes soften if they are open. Let your shoulders fall again. We are going to return to the story, but slower now. Like walking through a museum at night. No hurry, no pressure, just you, the words, and the quiet space we made together. Then, the sky changed. Dark clouds gathered over the hills, fast, as if someone pulled them together with a rope. The air turned cool. And then the rain came. Not a soft rain, but a heavy, hard rain that filled the air and soaked the dry ground in minutes. The soldiers opened their mouths to the sky. They lifted their shields, turned them upside down, and caught the water. They drank. They laughed. They cried. Down on the hills, the enemy watched in silence, their plan broken by a storm no one had ordered. The army survived that day, and Marcus kept writing in his little book, through every other battle, through every other death, through every long year at the front. He never came home. In the winter of 180, at a camp near the northern edge of the empire, he fell ill. He was 58 years old. On the last night, when an officer asked him for a final message to give to the people, he is said to have whispered something simple, "Weep not for me. Weep for the world." Then he was gone, the last of the 5 good emperors, the man who never wanted to fight, but fought anyway, because the empire needed him to. And the little book with no title? It survived. Today we call it Meditations. It is not a grand speech to a crowd. It is a man, alone, teaching himself to stay calm. And after almost 2,000 years, it still teaches us. Now think about you, learning English in your quiet room. No one is watching. No one is cheering. Just you, a notebook, maybe a cup of something warm. Rain falls drop by drop. Words come one by one. You will not be perfect today. You will not be perfect tomorrow. But you can sit down with your mind, the way Marcus sat in his tent, and do the work, the quiet work, the private work. That is how a life changes, not in one loud moment, but in small repeated acts that nobody applauds. A quick note before we close: this story and these ideas are shared for education and reflection, not as a substitute for professional advice. If you feel heavy or uncertain in your own life, please reach out to a qualified professional who can help you personally. If you want to understand how ancient wisdom can build modern resilience, subscribe to Learn English Through History for more stories, and write one Stoic principle that stuck with you in the comments to practice your English. And remember what the rain taught the soldiers: the water comes, but only when the sky is ready. Keep listening, keep writing, keep going. So that is the story of Marcus Aurelius, a man who carried a little notebook through wars, plagues, and silent nights at the edge of the empire, teaching himself to stay calm when everything around him shook. His book, Meditations, was never written for an audience. It was one man, alone in a tent, learning to master the only thing he truly owned, his own mind. And that same quiet work is available to you, right now, in your own room, with your own notebook. These ideas are shared for education and reflection, not as a substitute for professional advice. If you feel heavy or uncertain in your own life, please reach out to a qualified professional who can help you personally. If you want to understand how ancient wisdom can build modern resilience, subscribe to Learn English Through History for more stories. And write one Stoic principle that stuck with you in the comments to practice your English.